The Last Wish. Andrzej Sapkowski's Witcher stories are dark, witty fantasy built around folklore, moral trade-offs, and grounded consequences. The early reading experience is episodic because the series begins with short stories, and that structure is a feature rather than a hurdle. You get variety in setting and mood, and you also learn the author's rules for tone, ethics, and how this world treats violence and power. Think of it as a set of sharp, modern fairy tales written with adult clarity and without melodrama. If you want the fastest correct entry, start here instead of jumping into the first novel. It gives you the context that later books assume, but it does not demand that you track a complicated history or a long list of names. Read it for voice and atmosphere first. Notice how often the narrative slows down for bargaining, conversations, and the social cost of making a choice. In this video, the goal is simple. I will give you a low-confusion starting path, explain why the short story volumes come first, and help you decide whether to continue into the saga. By the end, you should feel confident walking into a bookstore, picking the right first volume, and ignoring editions that try to sell you the saga too early. If you want to keep the tone steady, read in shorter sessions, and stop before you feel tired. Dark fantasy can feel heavier when you binge it, and this series is better when you give the dialogue room to breathe. If you want to keep the tone steady, read in shorter sessions, and stop before you feel tired. Dark fantasy can feel heavier when you binge it, and this series is better when you give the dialogue room to breathe. The Last Wish. The most common mistake is treating The Witcher like a standard epic fantasy series, where book 1 is the obvious start. It is not built that way. The author originally wrote these as shorter pieces, and the collections create the foundation that the later novels lean on. Starting with the short stories reduces intimidation, because you can finish a complete arc in one sitting and still feel forward movement. It also teaches you how the series handles stakes. The Witcher is not a power fantasy. It prefers messy outcomes, imperfect information, and social pressure that makes every decision feel costly. That is why readers who begin with the novels sometimes feel unmoored. They are missing the baseline for what counts as normal in this world, what kind of humor is typical, and what the series considers a fair price for getting through a crisis. If you only remember one rule, make it this: short stories first, then the novels. It is the fastest way to get the series' full flavor without doing extra research or relying on recaps. If you want to keep the tone steady, read in shorter sessions and stop before you feel tired. Dark fantasy can feel heavier when you binge it, and this series is better when you give the dialogue room to breathe. If you want to keep the tone steady, read in shorter sessions and stop before you feel tired. Dark fantasy can feel heavier when you binge it, and this series is better when you give the dialogue room to breathe. The Last Wish. Treat this book as your foundation layer. Read it in order, even if individual stories feel self-contained, because the collection is arranged to create a gradual ramp in style and intensity. The best way to approach it is to focus on 3 anchors. First, the voice. Sapkowski writes with a practical, matter-of-fact attitude toward danger, which keeps the mood dark without sliding into horror or shock writing. Second, the social texture. You will see everyday details like work, money, and reputation matter as much as swords and spells. Third, the moral framing. Many fantasy books present a clean line between good and evil. Here the line is blurry, and the pressure comes from conflicting obligations rather than from a single villain. If you are a beginner, do not stop to look up lore. Let the stories teach you by repetition. After 2 or 3 pieces, you will start recognizing the series' patterns, and you will read faster and with more confidence. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. Sword of Destiny. This is the bridge between the introductory story collection and the start of the novel arc. The reason it belongs early is simple. It deepens the series' core themes and makes the transition into the saga feel earned rather than abrupt. Readers who skip it often feel that the first novel begins midstream, as if they missed an important conversation. Reading this second prevents that confusion. It also shows you a wider emotional register. The Witcher can be sharp and sardonic, but it can also be quietly reflective, especially when choices have consequences that do not resolve cleanly. Think of this volume as the moment when the short story form starts to behave like a set of connected chapters. You will still get the satisfaction of finishing individual arcs quickly. At the same time, you will feel the series tightening into a longer shape. That tightening is what prepares you for Blood of Elves without any whiplash. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. Sword of Destiny. Read this as confirmation, not as homework. By the time you get here, you already know whether you like the author's voice. Now you are checking whether you like the series when it becomes more interconnected. The stories lean more toward continuity, so pay attention to recurring ideas rather than treating each piece as a separate fable. A useful mindset is to ask what the world rewards and what it punishes. The Witcher often portrays institutions as messy and self-interested, and it treats competence as something that can still be constrained by politics. That creates a distinctive tension. Even when a scene is exciting, the bigger pressure comes from systems that do not change just because a hero wants them to. If you are the kind of reader who likes standalones, you can still enjoy this book one story at a time. If you are the kind of reader who wants a series arc, this is the volume that signals you will get one. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. Blood of Elves. This is where The Witcher shifts into a more traditional novel rhythm. Scenes run longer, subplots braid together, and the series starts to feel like a journey rather than a set of legends. That change is exactly why the short stories come first. Without them, this book can feel like you walked into an ongoing conversation. With them, it feels like you are finally seeing the larger picture the stories were hinting at. For beginners, the best approach is to read for momentum, not for mastery. Expect some unfamiliar terms and references. Do not treat that as a problem. The writing is designed so you can infer meaning from context, and you will adjust quickly because you already learned the tone in the story collections. If you enjoy novels that balance action with dialogue, politics, and consequences, Blood of Elves is the moment when the series clicks into place. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. Blood of Elves. Here is the simplest reading plan that stays correct and keeps confusion low. Read The Last Wish first, then read Sword of Destiny, then read Blood of Elves. After that, continue with the main novels in order, using publication order as the default unless you have a special reason not to. For most readers, that is the least confusing path because it matches how information is revealed. If you want a pacing plan, try one story per evening for the first 2 books. Those volumes are built for that kind of routine. Then switch to a chapter-based rhythm once you reach Blood of Elves. A good beginner rule is to stop at a natural chapter break, not at an exciting moment. So your next session starts calmly and you keep your reading habit stable. This is a series where steadiness pays off. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. The Last Wish. A quick note about editions and translation, because The Witcher can look inconsistent across bookstores. Different publishers and reprints change cover art, formatting, and back cover copy, and some blurbs assume you already know the world. None of that changes the correct entry. What matters is the title and the ISBN. If you see a box set that begins with Blood of Elves, treat it as a later purchase rather than your entry point. The short story books are the real start. Also be aware that short story collections can be marketed as optional, because retailers assume readers want a numbered saga. Ignore that marketing signal. For this series, the collections are not side quests. They are the orientation and the tone setters. If you buy only one book to test the series, make it The Last Wish, because it lets you sample the author's style quickly without committing to a long arc. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. Sword of Destiny. If you are coming from games or television, the biggest trap is assuming you already know the story and can skip what looks like setup. The reading experience is different. The books are less about spectacle and more about voice, irony, and the way small decisions create lasting consequences. That is why detailed summaries are not helpful here. They strip away the texture that makes scenes land. If you want the books to feel fresh, avoid wiki browsing between chapters. Let the author control the drip of information. Treat adaptation knowledge as background color, not as a map you must follow. Sword of Destiny is especially good at resetting expectations, because it rewards readers who pay attention to tone and conversation, rather than to checklist lore. Read it slowly enough to hear the cadence of the sentences, but fast enough to keep the mood intact. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. Blood of Elves. What should you skip early? Skip the urge to build a master timeline. Skip read-along guides that label every reference as essential, and skip side material until you have finished the core entry path, because extra material is only fun when you already care. A beginner-friendly rule is to earn complexity. Start with the 2 short story books and the first novel. Then decide if you want more. If you do, continue the saga in order. If you do not, you can stop without feeling like you failed. These 3 volumes give you a complete sense of tone and direction. They are enough to decide whether you like Sapkowski's approach to fantasy, which is more skeptical and conversational than many modern series. That is a useful result on its own. A practical tip is to keep a simple note of what you enjoyed, like the humor, the moral tension, or the slower political conversations. That way, when you pick up the next volume, you can choose based on taste rather than on fear of missing something. The series rewards steady attention, not encyclopedic memory. The Last Wish. Here is the decision path. If you want the fastest correct entry, start with The Last Wish. If you finish it and want the same voice with deeper continuity, go to Sword of Destiny. If you want the saga-style experience with longer scenes and broader scope, begin that phase with Blood of Elves after the short stories. This sequence gives you clarity for the least effort. It also aligns with how the series teaches you its world, which means you spend less time confused and more time enjoying the tone. If you want a single purchase today, buy The Last Wish and commit to reading 3 stories. That is enough to know whether the series works for you. If it does, follow the path in order and you will have a smooth, confident start that stays correct no matter how many sequels you eventually read. If you want to keep the tone steady, read in shorter sessions and stop before you feel tired. Dark fantasy can feel heavier when you binge it, and this series is better when you give the dialogue room to breathe. If you want to keep the tone steady, read in shorter sessions and stop before you feel tired. Dark fantasy can feel heavier when you binge it, and this series is better when you give the dialogue room to breathe.